This is Seung, and I'm the Principal and Director of Sky Academy, and I want to congratulate you for coming this far. We've finished yet another chapter. We finished the chapter on equations and inequalities, yes? So let me now just wrap up everything that we've done with equations and inequalities, this particular chapter so far, okay, up until now, okay? So there's there's 4 or 5 main things that we've done, okay? We looked at equations, we looked at inequalities, right? We looked at absolute value, right? And equations to do with absolute value. We looked at equations, not just in single variable, but with quadratics. And we also looked at double variable or simultaneous equations in 2 variables, and we looked at simultaneous equations, both linear and those involving quadratics. Okay, so let me just quickly go through what we did in each of those different each of those different headings. So with single variable equations, I basically started off by introducing you to the concept of backtracking, yes? And we learned how to backtrack with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now, backtracking is the process of undoing an operation to get back to your unknown variable. Yes, so we learn how to do that, and we learn how to apply that in multi-step equations. So some equations that involve more than one step of backtracking. Yes, so we did that. We then looked at inequalities. Yes, we learned how to represent inequalities on a number line, and remember that we had greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to being our 4 main signs in inequalities when doing inequalities. Yes, we also learnt some rules, because unlike equations, inequalities involves being a little bit more careful, because sometimes greater than or less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to can swap signs. You can swap signs, and there are certain rules that we need to follow that as to when we swap sides and when we don't. Okay, so some of those rules involve we change signs when we're either multiplying or dividing by a negative number. We don't need to change signs when adding or subtracting by a positive or negative number on either side, the left-hand side or the right-hand side, but when we multiply and divide, we need to remember to change the sign. Yes? When we're swapping the left-hand side and the right-hand side over, the sign also has to follow, yep, that as well, right? And then we also looked at 2 different ways of solving inequalities that involve pronumeral expressions in the denominator. Yes, so one of those methods involves multiplying by the square of the denominator, both sides by the square of the denominator. And another way is you multiply by the denominator on both sides, but you need to consider the positive and the negative cases of multiplying by the denominator. Sometimes the denominator can be a positive value, all right, and you need to consider that case, and sometimes you know, the denominator can be a negative value, in which case you need to account for the sign there, yes? So we learn how to do inequalities, yes? The next thing that we learned how to do was absolute value, and we looked at the definition of what an absolute value was. Algebraically speaking, the absolute value of x is really the square root of the square of x. In other words, x as a positive value. All right, so that's really just a complicated way of saying that we're looking at the positive value that x can be, that a pronumeral can be. So if x is a negative number, it'll be the positive value. If x is a positive number, it'll also be the positive value. Yes, so absolute value is really just the positive value of the distance that a value is from the center 0, from the origin 0. We looked at solving equations that involved absolute value, yeah? And we also looked at sketching absolute value graphs, right? So there are episodes to do with each one of these. The next thing that we learned how to do, right, and we do this in other chapters as well. We also did it in the basic algebra section, was we learned how to solve quadratic equations. Yes. So we learnt the 4 main ways of solving our quadratic equations, being the product sum method for factorizing and then solving, the cross method for factorizing and then solving, the completing the square method for factorizing and solving, or the quadratic formula, which is x equals to minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Yeah, so we've learnt how to solve quadratic equations using the formula, and then we looked at word problems that involve quadratics. Yes, so there's a whole episode dedicated to that. Yeah, and then finally what we did was we looked at simultaneous equations. Now, simultaneous equations are when you basically have more than one equation operating, both equations having 2 variables, a maximum of 2 variables, of up to 2 variables, and you have to work out using those 2 equations what those 2 variables are. Now, on a number plane, when you've got simultaneous equations, what the answer represents is the point of intersection between the curves that are governed by those 2 equations. So if you've got 2 straight lines, yeah, and each of those straight lines is part of the simultaneous equation, is an equation within the simultaneous set of equations, then the point of intersection of those 2 lines will be the solution of those simultaneous equations. Yes? So we learned how to solve simultaneous equations both graphically and algebraically using linear equations. Yeah, and the 2 main methods that we learnt were the substitution method, and there's an episode devoted to that, and the elimination method. There is an episode devoted to that as well. Finally, we also got to see simultaneous equations in action, where it's not just linear equations but quadratics as well. And the surprising thing, or not the surprising thing, but the thing that's special about simultaneous equations involving quadratics is you might have, in some occasions, you might have up to two solutions. Yeah, you might have 1 solution, you might have 2 solutions, you might have no solutions. But we'll look at that in more detail when we do the quadratic functions chapter. Yeah, but for the time being, I want you to see that what we did in this unit of work, or this chapter of work, was equations in a single variable, inequalities in a single variable, absolute value, okay, both equations and graphing. We looked at quadratic equations, and we looked at simultaneous equations involving both linear and quadratic equations. Yeah, so thank you very much for watching. I'm going to stand to the side now. If there's any part of that where you feel like you need to go back and review a specific episode, please do that. Otherwise, I'll let you take this summary in. I'll stand to the side, and I'll see you on the next chapter. Thank you. Bye.